This story is about a traveler who was a victim, crushed under the weight of anxiety and defeat. They were a prisoner who didn't even know how to fight back. But what if that same person could be fully armed, ignited by prayer, and learn to enforce their authority over the chaos? This is the blueprint for becoming a warrior. If you're ready to get your armor, smash that like button and subscribe to this channel. The traveler awoke, or perhaps they simply returned to awareness, for the line between dreaming and waking had blurred into a single, gray, listless expanse. There was no sound of birds. There was no warmth from the Sunday. There was only the familiar, heavy blanket of quiet and the chill that seemed to emanate not from the air but from within. This was the traveler's world. It was not a physical place defined by walls or landscapes, but an internal prison of persistent anxiety and a deep, settled despair. Before their eyes were fully open, the ache of defeat was already present. It was a cold, smooth stone in their stomach. With it came the whisper. It was not a loud voice, but a persistent, insidious breath that had become the traveler's only companion. "You are spiritually poor," it hissed, the sound curling around the edges of their mind. "You are powerless. You are utterly, completely, and permanently alone." The traveler believed it. How could they not? All evidence pointed to its truth. They sat up, the movement feeling heavy, as if they were wading through deep water. The fog in the room was thick. It was a gray, swirling mist that obscured the corners of their small space, making the world feel undefined and threatening. It clung to their skin, damp and cold. The traveler tried to pray. The motion was automatic, a habit from a life they barely remembered. The words formed in their mind, but their lips felt too heavy to move. When they finally pushed a sound out, it was dry and small. The prayer felt like a stone dropped into a bottomless well. There was no splash, no echo, just a silent, terrifying fall into nothing. They had been here for a long time, so long, in fact, that they could no longer recall a time before the gray. They could not remember the feeling of joy or the sound of their own laughter. Life was a series of moments, each one endured, each one leading only to the next. This isolation was absolute. It was the only reality. The whispers had convinced them that this prison was not only their fault, but their destiny. They were here because they deserved to be. They were alone because they were not worthy of being found. The fog was not just around them, it was in them. The traveler pulled their knees to their chest, a small defensive posture against the overwhelming emptiness. They faced another day, not with any hope of victory, but with the simple, exhausted resignation of survival. The whisper settled in, content. The echo of defeat had won again. The traveler sat in the gray, suffocating silence for a long time, the echo of defeat settling in their bones. This prison was all they knew, but in their despair they were sifting through the dust of their own emptiness, a restless, aimless motion. Their hand, moving through the fog, brushed against something that was not cold mist. It was solid. They recoiled for a moment, startled. Solidity was a foreign concept here. Cautiously, they reached out again. Their fingers met a hard edge, then a textured surface, leather. They pulled the object close. It was a book, an ancient text. It felt impossibly heavy in their hands, heavy with a reality that the gray fog lacked. It was not a product of the prison. It was an artifact from somewhere else. A tremor of something unfamiliar, perhaps fear, ran through them. The whispers in their mind grew quiet, watchful. The traveler opened the cover. The pages were thin, like old linen, and the words on them were stark and black. They began to read, their voice a dry croak in the stillness. At first, the words were just sounds, but then a sentence snagged their mind, holding it fast. They read it once, and it made no sense. They read it a second time, and it felt like a small, sharp stone in their shoe. They read it a third time, aloud. "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places in Christ." The travelers' breath caught. They stared at one word, a word of only 3 letters, has. It was a past tense reality. It was not a promise of a future rescue. It was not a hope for what might be. It was a divine disclosure, a statement of a fact that was already complete. The text claimed they had been blessed, not partially, but with every spiritual blessing. A deep, painful conflict tore through the traveler's soul, a violent wave of cognitive dissonance. If this was true, if they were spiritually wealthy, then what was this? They looked around at the gray, swirling fog. They felt the cold stone of defeat in their stomach. This was not wealth, this was poverty, this was starvation. "You are poor," the old, familiar whisper returned, sensing the challenge. "You are powerless. This book is a lie." But the weight of the book in their hands felt more real than the whisper. The traveler read the lines again. The text was not a feeling, it was a declaration. The traveler was stunned, caught between 2 opposing realities. Their entire life had been defined by the lie that they were a spiritual beggar. This text claimed they were an heir. The metaphor struck them with the force of a revelation. They were like an orphan, living in filth, begging for scraps, completely unaware that they were sitting on a vast, forgotten inheritance. The lie they had believed without question was suddenly, terribly challenged by a truth they could not yet comprehend. For the first time, the traveler looked at the gray fog of their prison and wondered if it was the lie and the book was the truth. The traveler's hands trembled as they held the ancient text. The fog had not left the room, but their entire focus was narrowed to the words on the page. It was as if the book itself was a small point of light in the overwhelming gray. They read on, driven by a new, desperate hunger. This inheritance was not abstract. It was not a vague feeling of comfort. The text began to list the deposits, one by one. They were not listed like a simple shopping list, but woven together like a tapestry of divine disclosure. Their finger traced the first word, chosen. The traveler stopped. Chosen. The whispers had always told them they were an accident, a random collection of dust, overlooked and unwanted. But this text declared they were chosen. They read the next. Adopted. A deep ache throbbed in their chest. The feeling of being an orphan, of being utterly alone, was the very foundation of their prison. But this text said they were adopted, not a servant, not a stranger, but a son or daughter. They read on, accepted, redeemed, forgiven, sealed. Each word was a key. Each phrase was a weapon, a fortress. The traveler repeated them, letting the sounds fill their small, cold space. Chosen. The whispers said they were a mistake. Adopted. The whispers said they were alone. Accepted. The whispers said they were worthless. Forgiven. The whispers insisted they were defined by their failures and shame. But the traveler still felt worthless. They still felt the chill of the fog. They still felt alone. Their emotions were in direct contradiction to the text. They wanted to throw the book down, to call it a liar, just as the whispers were screaming at them to do. But then, they found the most crucial secret of all. They read that the spiritual world operates by legal truth, not feelings. Their access to this wealth was not based on emotion, it's based on covenant. The traveler's mind reeled. They had been trying to feel their way to freedom. They had been waiting for their emotions to change, for the feeling of defeat to lift. But this text claimed their feelings were irrelevant to the truth. The truth was a legal, established fact. They were chosen, they were adopted. The metaphor crystallized in their mind, sharp and painful. They had been living like a beggar next to a bank holding millions in their name, but they had never logged in to check the balance. They had been starving, not because there was no food, but because they did not know the feast was theirs. The quest was no longer to earn these blessings. The traveler realized they could not fast or strive or manipulate their way into them. The quest was simply to understand what was already given. The problem was not their circumstance. The problem was their ignorance. The prison was not locked from the outside. They had been holding the key all along, believing it was just a worthless piece of metal. This revelation was dizzying. Hope, a feeling so long forgotten it was almost alien, returned as a sharp, unfamiliar pain in their chest. The traveler felt a compulsive pull to read more. This was not just a book, it was a map, a way out. They turned a page, and their eyes fell on a line that seemed to vibrate with a power that silenced the entire room. The whispers, the fog, the chill, everything paused. He chose us in him before the foundation of the world. The traveler read the sentence again, and a third time. Their minds struggled to grasp the timeline. Before the world, before the first day, before the fog had ever formed, before their own birth, before their first memory, their first failure, their first taste of despair, before any of it, their name was known. This was not just an inheritance, this was an identity. This was not a reaction to their failure. This was an action that preceded creation itself. The book offered them new words for their own life. You are not an accident. You are not random. You are not coincidence wrapped in flesh. The traveler spoke the next line aloud, their voice trembling. You are not a reaction. You are a revelation. As the truth of this settled, the atmosphere in the prison changed. The fog, which had momentarily stilled, began to react. It swirled violently. It darkened from gray to a deep, menacing black. The whispers which had fallen silent returned. But this was not the hissing of a companion. This was the roar of an enemy. The lie did not want to be displaced. The traveler felt a cold wave of terror. The shadows in the prison seemed to pull back, hissing, and from them emerged the echoes of the past. It was, as the text described, every voice that ever said, "You're not enough." Every memory that whispered, "You're unwanted." "You are not enough," a voice screamed in their memory, the voice of a parent, a teacher, a lost friend. "You are unwanted," shrieked another, a memory of profound rejection. "You are a mistake," the old, original whisper roared, trying to drown out the text. The fog coalesced into images of their deepest shame, their most secret failures. The attack was overwhelming. The traveler recoiled, dropping the book. The whispers surged, sensing victory. "See? Nothing. You are nothing." The traveler was on the floor, gasping, but their eyes were fixed on the open book. They were caught in a crossfire. The text on the page said they were an eternal intention, selected with precision. The voices in their heads said they were a temporal accident. The battle for their identity had truly begun. It was not a battle of flesh, but a war between truth and lies. The traveler, trembling with an effort that felt like it would tear them apart, reached for the book. They clutched it to their chest. Then, pushing past the terror, they stood up and spoke to the roaring darkness. "He chose me," they said, their voice weak but clear. "He chose me before the foundation of the world." The sound of their own voice speaking the truth, small as it was real. The shadows recoiled. The roaring voices hissed, falling back, baffled by this new resistance. The traveler stood, breathless, in the center of the room, holding the text. The war was far from over, but the first shot had been fired. The traveler stood in the swirling fog, clutching the ancient text to their chest. The battle was far from over. The voices of the past, having recoiled from the traveler's first defiant words, now surged back with a new, cruel strategy. The crossfire was intense. The text in their hands declared they were chosen, but the voices in their minds screamed that they were unwanted. Chosen? A voice, sharp and cold as glass, mocked them. It was a voice from their childhood. Look at you. You were always too quiet, too strange. You were never like the others. You were overlooked. You were left behind. Unwanted. Another voice joined, this one thick with scorn. Do you remember? Do you remember how they looked away? How they never called? You were always the last one, the one no one picked. The traveler winced. The fog in the room seemed to twist, showing them hazy, painful memories. They saw themselves as a child, standing alone. They saw themselves as an adult, watching others connect while they remained on the outside. These memories were the traveler's deepest wounds. The whispers were not just attacking, they were using the traveler's own history as a weapon. You are not enough, the voices whispered in a terrible chorus. You are flawed, you are broken, you are unlovable. The traveler's newfound strength wavered. The book felt heavy. The voices felt true because the feelings they brought were so real, so familiar. This was the core of their prison, the deep, unshakable belief in their own worthlessness. Their eyes fell back to the page, scanning desperately for an answer. How could they be chosen and yet so profoundly wrong? They read on, their finger tracing the words, moving past the section on adoption until they landed on a new phrase. It was a phrase so full of grace it seemed to hum on the page. He has made us accepted in the beloved. The traveler read it again. Accepted, not tolerated, not put up with, but accepted, welcomed, cherished, and not just accepted by anyone, but by the beloved. The traveler spoke the words into the fog. Accepted, in the beloved. The roaring voices in their mind suddenly faltered, as if a note of pure music had interrupted their harsh noise. The traveler felt something shift. It was, as the text itself described, as if that one phrase breaks the spine of rejection. They realized in a sudden, blinding flash of insight what they had been doing. Their entire life had been a desperate, exhausting search for approval. They had been searching for approval from people who can't even approve of themselves. They had been begging for validation from a broken world, a world of other prisoners, a world lost in the same fog. All that time, while they were begging for scraps of acceptance from below, the text declared that heaven had shouted over them, "This one is mine." The voices of rejection were still there, but their authority was broken. They were no longer the jailer. They were just noise. They were the lies of the prison. The traveler's identity was not built on the shifting sands of human opinion, but on the bedrock of a divine declaration. They were not an outcast. They were accepted. The traveler was breathing heavily, the echoes of the defeated voices fading into the fog. The truth of being accepted was a shield, but the text had more. It was not finished revealing their new identity. The traveler's eyes found the word that had come just before, adoption. They read the line slowly. Having predestined us to adoption as sons by Jesus Christ to himself. This was different. This was more than just acceptance. Acceptance meant being welcomed in. Adoption meant being given the family name. The core lie of the traveler's prison had always been that they were an orphan, a wanderer with no connection and no home. But this text was a legal document. It declared that they had legal standing in God's house. An orphan might be pitied, a servant might be used, a stranger might be accepted. But a son, a daughter, they had full rights. They had access to his heart, access to his voice, access to his authority. This revelation directly countered the lie that they were alone. They were not alone, they were family. As this truth settled into their mind, the traveler continued to read, and they found a promise that was even more immediate, more personal. In him you also trusted, after you heard the word of truth, in whom also, having believed, you were sealed with the Holy Spirit of promise. The traveler paused, pondering this new word, sealed. What did it mean to be sealed? A letter is sealed for security. A document is sealed for authenticity. A possession is sealed to show ownership. This seal, the text explained, was divine proof. It was heaven's down payment on your eternity. A down payment, a guarantee, a promise that the one who bought them would return for his purchase. For the first time, in all the years of the gray fog and the cold despair, the traveler felt something new. It was not an emotion that they generated. It was not the familiar cold of the prison. It was a presence. A warmth, subtle as a breath, began to stir inside their chest. It was a quiet, steady, inner witness. It was the Spirit inside, testifying daily that you belong to God and no one else. This presence was real. It was more real than the fog. It was more real than the despair. It was the Spirit itself, bearing witness to the truth of the text. And as this new warmth spread from their heart, a new sound filled the room. It was not the sound of whispers. It was the sound of metal groaning. The traveler looked down. The heavy chains that had been locked around their wrists and ankles for as long as they could remember. They were beginning to rust. The gray metal was flaking, turning a deep, dark red. The chains of spiritual poverty were not as permanent as they had seemed. The presence within them was corrosive to the prison. They were not free yet, but the prison itself was beginning to decay. Days or perhaps weeks passed. The traveler's reality had changed, but their circumstance had not. The chains were rusting, but they were still heavy. The fog had thinned, but it still obscured the way. The voices of defeat were quieter, but they still lurked in the corners. The traveler felt a deep, agonizing frustration. "I have the text," they whispered, their voice hoarse. "I have the knowledge. I know I am chosen. I know I am adopted. I know I am sealed." They rattled the rusting chains. "So why am I still here? Why do I still feel trapped?" The old sense of failure returned. They felt like a spiritual beggar who had been shown a menu from a king's feast, but was still starving outside the gate. They had all this knowledge, but they could not make it work. They were still a prisoner. Just a prisoner who was now agonizingly aware of what freedom was supposed to feel like. They returned to the text, but this time not with hunger, but with desperation. "What am I missing?" They pleaded to the silent room. They turned a page and found a new passage. This passage was different. It was not a declaration of truth. It was a prayer. It was the prayer of the author, Paul, written down for the very people he was writing to. The traveler's eyes scanned the words, and their hearts stopped. He was not praying for their comfort. He was not asking God for their provision, not for protection, not even for peace. The traveler read the prayer aloud, "That the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, may give you the spirit of wisdom and revelation in the knowledge of him, the eyes of your understanding being enlightened." The traveler fell to their knees. The book lay open on the cold floor, the eyes of your understanding. They understood in an instant. The author was praying that their eyes would open. They had been blind. They had been trying to understand heavenly truth with their earthly mind. They had been trying to feel their way out of a spiritual prison. The traveler realized their own prayers had been wrong. They had been praying like a beggar, pleading, "Get me out of here, give me food, give me freedom, give me peace." They were asking for crumbs when heaven is offering keys. Their entire posture changed. The frustration and despair vanished, replaced by a single, focused, desperate plea. They were no longer a beggar. They were a blind child asking to see. They closed their eyes, not in defeat but in supplication. They stopped asking for things. They stopped asking for escape. They laid their hands on the open page and whispered the one prayer that mattered. Let me see. Father of glory, give me the spirit of revelation. Open my eyes. The traveler remained on their knees, repeating the plea. Let me see. Open my eyes. The room was quiet. The fog was still. They were waiting, not for a sound, but for a change in perception. They had been trained by experience their whole life, discipled by the gray, listless reality of their senses. Now, they were asking to be trained by revelation. They opened their eyes and looked at the text one more time. As they did, it felt as if the words themselves were exploding with new light. Their gaze fell on a line in the next section of the text, a line they had read before but had never seen, and raised us up together, and made us sit together in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. The traveler stared at the verbs, raised, made us sit. Past tense, they breathed. Not he will make us. This is already done. A profound, logical crisis shook them. How could this be? How could they be sitting in heavenly places when they were kneeling on the cold floor of a prison? It was an impossible position. It made no logical sense. The whispers, sensing this paradox, returned. Look at you, they hissed, dripping with mockery. You are on the floor. You are in the dirt. You are still in chains. This book is madness. It is a lie. Your feelings are the truth. Your prison is your reality. The traveler's head swam with confusion. But then, the spirit of revelation, the very spirit they had asked for, answered. It was not a voice, but a sudden, heart-stopping shift in perspective. It was as if they were looking through a new set of eyes. They were not in the prison. They were looking down on the prison. The traveler on the floor, the one who was cold and afraid, the one kneeling in the fog, that was the old man. That was the flesh, the part of them that had been trained by experience, the part that had been discipled by defeat more than by the word. But their true self, their reborn spirit, was not there. Their spirit had already been raised and seated with Christ in heavenly places. The prison was real. The fog was real. The battle was real, but it was beneath them. The prison was not their home, it was a battlefield. The traveler, their true self, was not a prisoner of the fog. They were a heavenly citizen on assignment. They were looking at the fog from above. This revelation changed everything. The war, they realized, was not over your situation. The war is over your perspective. The enemy did not need to steal your authority if he could keep you unaware of it. The traveler, the one who was seated in the high places, looked down with compassion at the kneeling figure in the fog. They were no longer a victim. They were a son with authority. The walls of the prison had not vanished, but the traveler was no longer inside them. The traveler stood in the new, clear space of their mind. The fog had not vanished, but it had receded, pulling back from the center of the room to swirl in the corners, watchful and thin. The rusting chains still hung from their wrists, but the weight felt different, more like a memory of bondage than a current reality. The revelation of their position, this impossible position, was a shield. They were seated in the heavenly places. The prison was beneath them. This new perspective held for a long time. The traveler practiced it. They would look at the gray walls and remind themselves, I am not in this. I am above this. They would feel the familiar chill and declare, my true self is not cold. My true self is seated with him. It was a divine disclosure that they had to choose, moment by moment, over the evidence of their senses. Then, one day, the attack came. It always came. It was the old, familiar enemy, a storm of intense anxiety and confusion. It did not ask for permission. It swept in, a spiritual wickedness, a suffocating pressure that waged war against their mind. The thin fog in the corners instantly exploded, darkening into a churning, violent vortex. The whispers returned, no longer hissing, but screaming. "Liar, you are still here. You are a prisoner who learned a new word, nothing more. You are on the floor, you are in the dirt. Look, feel the fear, it is real. Your position is a metaphor. This terror is your reality. You are under it, you are crushed." In the past, the traveler would have buckled. They would have pulled their knees to their chest, crushed under the weight of the problem. That was the old reaction, that was the old man, and the temptation to do so now was overwhelming. The fear was paralyzing. The confusion felt like thick darkness. But this time something was different. They remembered. It was an agonizing effort, like lifting a weight too heavy to be borne. They had to fight their own emotions, their own experience. "No," the traveler whispered, their voice shaking. The figure on the floor, the one they could feel trembling, was the flesh. But their spirit was seated. With a choice that took all their will, they shifted their perspective. They ascended. They refused to react from the prison floor. They chose to reign from the high place. From this new position of authority, they looked down at the swirling black storm of anxiety. It was raging, yes, but it was beneath their feet. They were not in the storm. The storm was in the prison, and they were far above it. They were no longer a beggar, pleading for the storm to stop. They were a son, an heir, enforcing a victory that was already legally theirs. The travelers stood in that high place, in that throne room alignment, and they spoke. They did not plead, they decreed. "Peace," they commanded, their new voice clear and sharp, a sword of truth cutting the air. "Be still. You are confusion, and I am seated in clarity. You are fear, and I am seated in love. You are a lie, and I am in him who is truth. You have no jurisdiction here. You are beneath me. In the name of Jesus Christ, be silent." For a moment, the storm raged even harder, a final, defiant shriek. But the traveler did not flinch. They held their position. Then, it happened. The chaos stopped. The screaming whispers died, cut off. The swirling black vortex slowed, thinned, and dissipated, bowing to a greater reality. The suffocating pressure lifted. The fog receded, returning to the corners, defeated and silent. The traveler stood, breathing hard, not from fear, but from the effort of faith. They had not fought the storm, they had enforced their authority over it. For the very first time, the power the text spoke of was not just a concept, but an experience. They had reigned. In the aftermath of the victory, the prison was quiet. It was a new kind of quiet, one of peace, not despair. The travelers spent days exploring this new authority. They were no longer a victim. When the whispers of doubt returned, they spoke from their seat, and the whispers fled. They were powerful. But a new, subtle emptiness began to creep in. The prison was quiet, but it was still a prison. The fog was thin, but it was still present, and the traveler was still utterly alone. "I have authority," the traveler thought, "but I am an heir with no one to share the inheritance. I am a son in a house with no family. Is this all there is, to be alone but powerful?" The lie of isolation, the root of their orphan status, remained. They returned to the text, confused. What did I miss? They read on past the chapters on identity and authority and entered a new section. The author Paul spoke of a mystery, a secret plan that had been hidden for generations. The travelers' eyes widened. The text spoke of the Gentiles and the Jews, two groups of people who were separated by everything, by covenant, culture, and commandment. As the traveler read, a vision began to form in their mind. They saw a wall. It was an ancient, impossibly high structure, stretching as far as they could see. It was not made of simple brick, but of pride, prejudice, ego, and offense. It was a middle wall of separation that humanity had built to fragment itself. The traveler looked at this wall in awe and horror, and then they saw something that made their hearts stop. They saw their own bricks in the wall. They saw memories of their own isolation. They had used it as a defense in the prison, but it was also a brick. They saw their judgment of others, the quiet superiority they felt, the bitterness they held against those who had hurt them. They saw their prejudice, their preference, the way they had dismissed others who were not like them. Their pride, which had felt like a shield, was just another brick in this demonic wall. They were not just a prisoner. They had been a builder of the prison wall that kept everyone, including themselves, separated. They were reinforcing the very wall that defined their loneliness. A deep shame washed over them, but as they stared at the wall, the text provided the answer. The traveler read on, their voice trembling, "For he himself is our peace, who has made both one and has broken down the middle wall of separation, so as to create in himself one new man from the two, thus making peace." The vision in their mind shifted. They saw the cross. It was not a piece of poetic jewelry. It was an event, a legal act of divine power. In their vision, the cross of Christ swung like a mighty axe and struck the wall of separation. The impact was silent but absolute. The wall did not just crack, it was demolished, it shattered. The bricks of pride, prejudice, and offense crumbled into dust. The traveler felt their own defensive pride crucified with it. They stood in the vision, exposed as their personal walls were gone but liberated. The path was now open, the text was clear. Jesus didn't just die to forgive your sins. He died to create a new humanity. They were not meant to be a solo warrior. They were meant to be part of one new man. With the wall of separation demolished in their understanding, the traveler looked out. For the first time, they could see beyond their own fog, and what they saw was a vast plain littered with other stones. They were scattered, disconnected, and covered in the same dust as the traveler. Some were in their own small prisons of fog. Others were isolated, believing they were the only stone. The traveler had been so focused on their own identity that they had never truly seen the others. They returned to the text, and the metaphor of the wall gave way to a new one, a building. The traveler read, "Now therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone." The traveler's mind was arrested. They were not just a solo believer. They were a stone, and the text said they were being built together for a dwelling place of God in the Spirit. A new holy architecture unfolded in their mind. They saw a divine blueprint. At the very bottom was the cornerstone, a stone of impossible light and perfect alignment. From this stone the foundation spread out, strong and true, and upon that foundation the building was rising. The building was the church, and it was made of people. It was made of living stones. The traveler then looked at their own stone. It was misshapen. It was jagged from isolation, its edges sharp from pride and offense. It would not fit. It could not be built together with the other stones in its current condition. A profound sense of shame washed over them, a shame far deeper than their earlier isolation. This was not just about their loneliness. This was about the building. Their isolation, their refusal to connect, their judgment of the other stones. It was hindering the construction. God is not content to simply bless his people. The text seemed to cry out, he wants to inhabit them. The traveler finally understood. God was not building a cathedral made by hands. He was building a people. And this dwelling place could not be built with scattered stones. It could not host the glory of God if its parts were dismembered. Their individual rescue was never the final goal. The goal was corporate transformation. The traveler looked at their own jagged edges, the wounds and pride that kept them separate. "I must be reshaped," they whispered. "I must be made to fit." Their individual walk was not just about them, it was about the whole body. The traveler was shaken. The revelation of the living stones was profound, a divine blueprint that simultaneously offered a home and issued a challenge. But as the awe of this new understanding settled, a persistent, burning question remained. It was a question that began as a whisper in their own mind but soon grew into a desperate plea. Why? Why this unity? They asked the text, their voice echoing in the vast, quiet space that was once their prison. Why is it so important? The loneliness was a terrible pain, but this feels different. This feels strategic. They had been given a position of authority. They had been sealed and chosen. Why was it not enough to be a solitary victor? Why was this corporate identity, this joining, so non-negotiable? They turned the page, their fingers tracing the lines of the ancient book. And the text, as if it had been waiting for this very question, gave them the shocking answer. The author, Paul, wrote that this unity, this great mystery of the one new man, was not for the comfort of the stones themselves. It was to the intent that now the manifold wisdom of God might be made known by the church to the principalities and powers in the heavenly places. A coldness that had nothing to do with the prison air flooded the traveler's heart. Principalities and powers, they knew those names. These were not abstract concepts. These were the rulers of darkness, the ancient spirits, the dark, unseen intelligence that had commanded the whispers for all those years. This was the voice of the liar. This was the very enemy that had held them prisoner, the architect of the gray fog. The text was saying that the church, this body of living stones, was meant to be a declaration against them. Not a suggestion, not a hope, a declaration of war. A new, terrifying vision flooded the traveler's mind. It was more real than the prison had ever been. They looked up, not at the gray mist, but through it, into the realm of the Spirit. They saw the powers. They were shadows enthroned in high places, ancient, vast, and seething with a malice that defied human understanding. And these beings were watching. The revelation hit the traveler with the force of a physical blow, stealing their breath. They saw what the powers saw. They saw the stones scattered across the world, isolated in their own prisons of fog, dim, cold, and powerless. And they saw the shadows, the powers, moving freely among them, whispering the same lies of isolation, pride, and offense. And as the stones believed the lies, as they judged one another, as they drew back in pride and fear, the powers grew stronger. The traveler could feel their satisfaction, a soundless vibration of pure mockery that shook their soul. The prison was effective. The whispers were winning. The chaos of the enemy reigned. The text said it plainly. Division was not just dysfunction. It was rebellion against divine design. Then the vision shifted. The traveler saw something new. 2 stones, then 3, began to move. Driven by the Spirit, they were rolling together, laying down their pride, their sharp edges grinding against each other, conforming to the cornerstone, and as they aligned, they ignited. A light, pure and holy, blazed from their union. More stones joined, and the light grew, forming a living temple that pulsed with the very life of God. The traveler saw the powers react to this. The light was a weapon. It was a frequency of truth that they could not endure. The shadows recoiled in pain, hissing, their power broken, their lies exposed. This holy, unified body became a living rebuke, a fortress of light in the midst of darkness. It was the visible proof that the enemy's strategy of division had collapsed, that their deception worked no longer, that their ultimate defeat was sealed. The vision faded, The traveler was on their knees, weeping. They felt the full, sickening weight of their spiritual betrayal. A wave of nausea hit them. Every time they had gossiped, every time they had slandered another believer, every time they had judged another stone, they were not just being petty. They were truly siding with the powers. They were participating in a betrayal of their own kind. Every time they isolated themselves in pride, they were helping the enemy. They had been an unwitting agent of the very darkness that imprisoned them. Isolation was amputation, they breathed, the words from the text searing their conscience. They had not just hurt themselves, they had helped to maim the body. The quest was no longer about their personal breakthrough. That had been accomplished only to bring them to this point. This was about the building. This was about the war. A new, fierce love and urgent resolve filled their heart. It was a love for the other stones, a protective, desperate yearning to see them freed and joined. They looked out at the vast, empty space, knowing it was filled with others just like them. Their mission was clear and non-negotiable. They had to pursue reconciliation. They had to find the other stones. They had to lay down their right to be right and be knit together. Their freedom was not just for them, it was for the body. The mission had begun. The prison was quiet. The great spiritual eviction had cleansed the atmosphere. The traveler, for the first time, felt a profound, stable peace. The authority they had exercised was real. The connection to the other living stones was a tangible hope. The fog, once a suffocating blanket, was now just a thin, powerless mist in the distant corners. It seemed the primary battle was over. But as the traveler sat in this new quiet, holding the ancient text, they felt the book itself shift. The tone was no longer just a divine disclosure of wealth. It was no longer just a revelation of their position. The tone of the text became personal, urgent. It became a demand. The traveler read the words, and they felt like thunder in the quiet room. The author, a prisoner himself, beseeched them to walk worthy of the calling with which they were called. Beseech. It was a plea. The author was begging them. The traveler felt the weight of this. Their rescue was not the end of the journey. It was the beginning of the assignment. The text made it painfully clear that in the economy of the kingdom, a person's walk speaks far louder than their words. Their very life was a sermon. A new, daunting alignment was being required. The text was asking a question. If you are seated in heavenly places, why does your life sometimes still look like it is crawling in carnal patterns? The traveler began to see the gap. It was in the small things. A sudden, sharp thought of bitterness toward one of the other stones. A word that was almost slander, spoken in a moment of carelessness. A flicker of pride in their newfound authority. These were no longer just mistakes. The text made it painfully clear. Each one was a contradiction. Every time they harbored offense, they were walking in a way that was unworthy of the call. They were grieving the Spirit who had sealed them. This was not about earning their position. That was already done. This was about reflecting it. The posture of their life had to reflect the weight of their calling. The traveler understood. The grace that had rescued them from the prison was not just a pardon, it was a transformation. And that grace now demanded a response. Their habits, their thoughts, their tongue, their relationships, all of it must now be brought into rhythm with heaven. The call was clear. It was time to grow up. The traveler was arrested by this call to walk worthy. But as they began to try, they encountered a new enemy. This enemy was not the liar in the fog. It was not the powers in the high places. This enemy was intimate. It was inside them. They found the next command in the text, and it was the most demanding one yet, to put off concerning their former conduct the old man, which grows corrupt according to the deceitful lusts. The old man. As the traveler read this, a shadow version of themselves seemed to take shape in the room. It was the prisoner, It was the victim. It was the orphan. It was the self that had been sculpted not by the word but by wounds. It was the version of them that heaven had never authored. This shadow self was the part of them that secretly loved the prison. It was fed by sin and justified by culture. It was the part of them that knew how to fake maturity, how to nod in agreement with the text while sabotaging obedience in silence. And the text said this old man was not passive. It was growing corrupt. It was decaying in real time. It refused to die quietly. The traveler realized this was the source of the bitterness, the pride, the slander. It was the old man reasserting its control. The text was not metaphorical. It was commanding a spiritual dismantlement, a decisive separation. The traveler had to confront this shadow. The shadow whispered to them, but this time with a familiar, self-justifying tone. It insisted that they were only protecting themselves, that they deserved to be angry, that this was simply who they were. This was the war. The traveler had to look their former self in the face. They had to refuse to allow their past to speak louder than their promise. They stood, facing this shadow, this residue of who they used to be. They spoke to it. "You no longer speak for me," the traveler said, their voice resolute. "You no longer define me. You no longer decide how I respond, how I think, how I live. You are the former conduct, and I am putting you off." The shadow hissed and recoiled, but it did not disappear. The traveler understood. This was not a single moment. This was a daily battle. The separation had begun. The act of putting off the shadow self was exhausting. It was not a single event, a moment of triumph, but a daily, resolute, holy work. It was a constant war, a conscious choice made every hour. The traveler felt the immense struggle. Every morning, the shadow self was there waiting, patient and cunning. It was the echo of old habits, the well-worn path of survival from the prison. To refuse it, to choose a new path, required a spiritual and mental energy the traveler felt they did not possess. But the ancient text did not stop at separation. It did not just command a death, it commanded a resurrection. The traveler read the rest of the command, to be renewed in the spirit of their mind, and to put on the new man, which was created according to God in true righteousness and holiness. This was the other half of the battle. It was not enough to dismantle the old. They had to build the new. This new man was the real you, the resurrected you, the version of them that was fused with the divine. It was the identity that was created according to God, not according to wounds. The traveler realized a critical truth. If the mind did not change, the old man would simply revive. They could weep at the altar all day, but if they left, still thinking like a slave, the prison would rebuild itself around them. Their mind had to be fundamentally rewired. This renewal was not positive thinking. It was a radical, divine renovation. The work was intensely practical. It was not an abstract theory, but a series of small, moment-by-moment choices that were, in fact, decisive choices in the spiritual war. One day, the traveler caught themselves thinking about another living stone, someone who had hurt them in the past. The old man, the shadow self, loved this. It savored the judgment. It whispered its justifications. They deserve this. Remember what they did. It is not gossip if it is true. You are just processing the hurt. The traveler felt the familiar, cold satisfaction of feeling superior, of holding on to the offense. It felt like justice, but they recognized the trap. They remembered the command, renew the mind. They realized this pattern of thought was the old man. They had to actively replace it. With a true effort of will, a spiritual straining, the traveler forced themselves to speak a blessing over that person instead. It felt like sand in their mouth. It felt painful, false, and unnatural. But it was an act of construction. It was laying a new stone in the foundation of the new man. Another day, An old temptation, a deceitful lust as the text called it, rose in their mind. It was a powerful, familiar urge, an old pattern that had always offered a moment of escape or numbness inside the prison. The shadow self leaned in, seductively. Just a little, it is harmless. It is just a thought. You are free now, you can handle it. It will take the edge off the exhaustion. The pull was intense, a physical ache for the old comfort. But the traveler remembered the command, true righteousness and holiness. This impulse was not holy. They did not just resist it, they replaced it. They wrenched their mind away, as if physically turning their head, and forced it to focus on the words from the text, on the truth of the cornerstone. The desire did not vanish instantly, but its power was broken. They had starved the old man and fed the new. A wave of intense offense swept over them when they were treated unjustly. The old man roared to life. This is righteous anger. They cannot do that to you. Plan your defense. Plan your verbal counterattack. You must win this exchange. It felt completely logical. Mercy felt like weakness. Mercy felt like letting them win. But the traveler, with tears of frustration and pain in their eyes, chose mercy. They chose to bless. It felt like dying. With each choice, the shadow self grew weaker. It shriveled, and the new man rose. It grew stronger, more solid. The traveler began to think differently, to feel differently, to speak differently. What once tempted them now repulsed them. What once confused them now became clear. Their peace became contagious. Their discipline became inspiring. The fog in the prison did not just recede. It began to dissolve. The light emanating from the new man was too bright. It was burning the fog away. The old man was dying. The new man was alive. The traveler was transformed. The new man was alive and breathing. The prison felt more like a distant, painful memory than a current reality. Peace had become their new normal. They would wake, and the fog was gone. The air was clear. The text was a joy, not just a weapon. They felt safe. And yet, something was wrong. A familiar temptation, one they thought they had utterly defeated, began to circle back. It was a shadow on the edge of their vision, a flicker that would not leave. It began as a whisper, but over the course of several days it grew louder. Then one day, it attacked. It was not a whisper, it was a vortex. The exact temptation they thought was dead and gone returned with what felt like 10 times its original force. It was a blitz, a sudden, overwhelming assault. The traveler was caught completely off guard. They stumbled back. Their new defenses, the new man's instincts, seemed to fail. The peace they had grown accustomed to evaporated in an instant. Their prayers, which had been clear and powerful, suddenly felt like they were hitting a brass ceiling. The shadow that would not leave had returned, and it was mocking them. A profound, sickening wave of despair hit the traveler. Their confidence, built on their transformation, shattered. Why, they pleaded, not to the text, but to the empty room. I did everything. I put off the old man. I put on the new man. Why does this still have power over me? Was it all a lie? Was the transformation not real? This, they realized, was the true enemy's goal. Not just to make them stumble, but to make them believe that change itself was a fiction. In their desperation, they grabbed the text. They were not looking for comfort. They were hunting for an answer. Their eyes fell on a single, piercing line. It was a warning of terrifying clarity. Give no place to the devil. The traveler's blood ran cold. Give no place. The word give struck them. It was an act of permission, an invitation. The implication was staggering. The enemy could not steal territory. It had to be given. He could not take authority. It had to be handed over. The text explained that the original word for place was topos. It meant a region, an area, an opportunity, a foothold, a legal space. The enemy did not need much, the text warned. He just needed a crack, a conversation, a compromise. And once he got a foothold, he would build a fortress. This was not possession. It was permission. Not control, but cooperation. The traveler's mind raced, frantically searching for the crack. The enemy never knocked like a thief, the text said. He sneaked in like a friend. He wore the costume of comfort. The text named the gateways: anger that lingers, bitterness that simmers, words that corrupt, unforgiveness. The traveler's heart stopped. They remembered. Days ago, a small argument, a minor offense where they felt misunderstood. They knew they should have let it go. But the shadow self, the old man, had whispered, "It is okay to be upset. You were right. You are justified." And the traveler had agreed. They had held on to that small, simmering offense. They had not dealt with it. They had let the sun go down on their wrath. The revelation hit them with horror. The enemy did not care why they were offended. He just cared that they stayed that way. They realized that when they went to sleep with that offense, they woke up with torment. When they carried that bitterness, they had invited demonic activity to dance in their emotions. They had written a spiritual lease. They had given the enemy permission. They had made room. This circling, overwhelming temptation was not a failure of the new man. It was a foothold they had unknowingly given. They had given the enemy a key, and he was now using it to try to rebuild the prison. The revelation of the open door was devastating, but liberating. The problem had a name. It was not a weakness in the new man. It was a legal foothold that had to be broken. The text was not vague about the solution. This was not behavioral modification. This was spiritual eviction. Let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you. The traveler stood in the center of their space, which was no longer a prison but a temple that had been defiled. It was time to cleanse the house. First, they followed the strategy. Confess. They called it what it was. That was not righteous anger, they spoke aloud. It was wrath. I did not just vent. I used corrupt words. I have not been struggling. I have been holding on to bitterness. I admit it. Second, they repented. They turned their heart resolutely toward God. This was not just tears, it was change. Not just emotion, it was an exchange. I give you my compromise. I received your freedom. Third, they spoke. They used their mouth to declare the truth. They used their authority. Permission could be revoked. I tear up the lease of anger. I renounce every partnership with bitterness. I declare no more, not in my mind, not in my home, not in my mouth. I bind every demonic influence that came through this door. I loose the presence of God. The atmosphere shifted. It was a visible change. Light rushed in. The shadow that had been circling fled. Darkness had to flee. Finally, the traveler understood the last step. Close the door. Deliverance was not just about being free. It was about staying free. They could not break chains and keep souvenirs. They knew what this meant. They could not revisit the offense. They could not rehearse the argument. They had to burn the bridges, sanctify the space. They were called to expose darkness, not tolerate it. They had refused the enemy access. The temple was clean. The house was clean. The doors were shut. The traveler felt a holy peace. But they also knew for the first time that they were in a war zone. The enemy was real. Cleansing the house was defense. Now, it was time to prepare for the battle. They were no longer a prisoner. They were not just a stone in a building. They were a soldier. But they had been walking through a battlefield dressed like civilians, hoping for change while standing unarmed. The text thundered from the pen of Paul like a military commander. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. This was not poetic metaphor, the traveler realized. This was divine strategy. This was their survival kit. The enemy did not take days off, neither could they. This was a climactic moment. This was the suiting up. The traveler did it deliberately, piece by piece, naming each one as they put it on in the Spirit. First, they reached for truth. Having girded your waist with truth, this is the foundation, they declared. It holds everything together. No more lies, no more self-deception. They felt it tighten, securing them. Second, the breastplate of righteousness. This is not my self-righteousness, they prayed. It is Christ's righteousness. It covered their heart. It guards my emotions from the fiery darts of guilt, shame, and fear. Third, the shoes. Having shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace. My feet carry your message, they vowed. This is mobile warfare. I am not sprinting from crisis to crisis. I move strategically, carrying peace. Fourth, the shield. Above all, take the shield of faith. They lifted it. This is not a feeling. It is a shield. It blocks lies before they penetrate. It will be able to quench not some, but all the fiery darts. Fifth, the helmet. Take the helmet of salvation. They placed it on their head. My mind is a battlefield. This helmet guards my identity. It silences the inner critic. Every accusation from the enemy must hit this helmet before it hits my soul. When it was done, the traveler stood differently. They were no longer a victim. They were not defenseless. They were armored, anointed, appointed for this hour. They were fully armed. The traveler stood fully armored. They felt secure, protected, anchored, but they felt defensive. They were ready to stand, but how did they fight back? They looked back at the text and found the final pieces of the arsenal. First, the weapon, and take the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. The text called it their only offensive weapon. The traveler looked at the ancient book in their hands. It was not just a map. It was not just a legal document. It was the weapon itself. They drew the sword. It was not cold steel. It was the living word. It cut through lies. It rebuked the enemy. It shifted atmospheres. Jesus did not debate Satan in the wilderness. The revelation came. He quoted scripture. But the armor and sword still felt cold. They were missing the power source. They read the final command in the section. Praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit. This was it. Prayer was not the caboose of the armor. It was the ignition. It activated the gear. It opened their eyes. It sharpened their sword. Prayerless warriors were powerless targets. The traveler closed their eyes and did as the text commanded. They began to pray in the Spirit. A fire ignited within them. The armor began to glow with a heavenly light. The sword in their hand felt alive. At that moment, the liar from chapter 1, the original whisper of defeat, returned for a final assault. It hissed from the shadows, a voice of pure malice. You are still a prisoner, it lied. You are just a fool in a costume. You are weak. You are alone. In the past, the traveler would have cowered, but now they did not flinch. They did not debate. They stood armored, ignited by prayer, and they lifted the sword. They advanced, and with each step, they spoke the truth that was written. They declared the truth that God had blessed them with every spiritual blessing. The shadow recoiled as the sword flashed. They declared the truth that they were seated with Christ in heavenly places. The shadow hissed, dissolving at the edges. They declared the truth that they were chosen, adopted, and sealed. They declared that they were the righteousness of God. With each word, the sword of the Spirit cut through the lies. The shadow could not stand against the truth. It shrieked and dissolved into nothing. The liar was silenced. The warrior was victorious. The battle was won. The enemy was defeated. The liar was gone. The prison itself had dissolved. The fog had lifted completely. The traveler stood in a new, bright, open space of freedom. They stood for a long time, breathing in the clean air. But as the adrenaline of battle faded, they felt a deep weariness. The armor, though victorious, was heavy. The fight had taken strength. They realized a new truth. They could not live this Christian life in their own strength. They could win the battle and still run dry. They were created to be a vessel, not a source. And vessels must stay full. They looked at the ancient text one last time. It had one final mystery to reveal, not how to fight, but how to walk. And do not be drunk with wine, it commanded, but be filled with the Spirit. The traveler understood the contrast. One was artificial escape, the other was supernatural empowerment. One dulled the senses, the other awakened them. They saw that the verb was in the present continuous tense. It meant being filled, over and over, continually. This was not a one-time event. It was a lifestyle. It was the secret to everything. The traveler, the armored warrior, did one final thing. They knelt. They did not kneel in defeat, as in chapter 1. They knelt as an empty vessel. They emptied themselves of pride, of noise, of self-reliance, and even of the pride of their own victory. They lifted their hands, just as the text urged, and cried out from the depth of their soul. Holy Spirit, they whispered, I do not want to just visit you. I want to host you. Fill me again. It was not a storm this time, it was a river. The same presence they had felt as a seal and as fire now flooded them as an endless river. It filled every empty place, every dry well. Joy erupted in their heart, a joy that had nothing to do with circumstances. It was overflowing. They began to sing, making melody in their heart to the Lord, gratitude in the face of their past struggle, peace in the middle of their new life. The story ended not with an ending, but with a new beginning. The traveler, once the defeated soul in the gray fog, was now a habitation for God. They were no longer reacting to life. They were reigning in life. They were not just free from prison. They were filled with the Spirit, and that was the truest freedom of all. This story offers several powerful lessons that resonate long after reading. Our feelings are not our reality. The traveler's prison was built on feelings of defeat and isolation. The key to their freedom was discovering a legal, established fact that contradicted their experience. The lesson is to anchor our identity in unchanging truth, not in our shifting emotions. We must fight from our position, not our condition. The impossible position is the story's climax. The traveler was simultaneously kneeling in a prison and seated in the heavenly places. They learned to stop reacting from the prison floor and start reigning from the high place. This is a crucial shift. We don't fight for victory. We fight from a victory that is already legally ours. Compromise is a coded invitation. The warning to give no place to the devil is a chilling and practical piece of advice. The traveler's foothold wasn't some dramatic failure. It was a small, simmering offense, and letting the sun go down on their wrath. This teaches that small, justified compromises in our heart, like bitterness or unforgiveness, are legal invitations for the enemy to re-enter and build a fortress. Freedom is not a solo project. The story powerfully pivots from individual breakthrough to corporate purpose. The traveler realizes they are a living stone and that their isolation and pride were bricks in the wall of separation. True victory is found in unity, as the joined church is meant to be a corporate declaration against the principalities and powers. Victory must be maintained. The final chapter provides the most critical lesson for life after the battle. The traveler, now a warrior, must be filled with the Spirit. This isn't a one-time event, but a lifestyle. We were created to be vessels, not a source, and a vessel must stay full. Ultimately, The story is a roadmap from being a prisoner of our past to becoming a habitation for God, showing that true freedom isn't just escaping the prison, it's being filled with the presence of God. If this story touched your heart, please give this video a like. It helps the light reach others who may need it. Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. I would love to hear what part spoke to you most. And if you wish to continue this journey of quiet stories, faith, and healing, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next chapter. May the light stay with you, always.